The year was 1942, and the Pacific Theater was drowning in the crimson tide of the Japanese juggernaut. Having swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, turned its sights toward New Guinea, the final gateway to mainland Australia. The elite Nankai Shitai, veterans of a dozen victories, began their advance across the Owen Stanley Range via the notorious Kokoda Track. To the Japanese command, the mission seemed inevitable. They possessed a religious faith in the Banzai charge, a tactic of overwhelming speed, mass numbers, and fanatical willpower that had shattered Allied lines from Malaya to the Philippines. In the dense, suffocating humidity of the New Guinea rainforest, the Japanese felt invincible. They were masters of the jungle, moving light and fast with a mindset that individual spirit could overcome any mechanical obstacle. They looked at the razor-backed ridges and the knee-deep mud of the Kokoda Track and made a fatal assumption. The Australians could never bring heavy weaponry into this vertical hell. Without artillery, the diggers would be forced into a purely infantry fight, a battle of bayonets and bravery that the Japanese were certain they would win. But at a place called Ower's Corner, the Japanese certainty was obliterated by a sound that should have been impossible. It was the sharp metallic bark of the QF 25-pounder. The sight was a nightmare for the Japanese scouts. Emerging through the mist and the mud, the Australians had performed a feat of engineering and sheer human desperation that defied logic. They had dismantled these massive multi-ton steel guns and hauled them by hand through the rainforest. Using ropes, pulleys, and the raw muscle of hundreds of men, they had dragged the 25-pounders up nearly vertical slopes and through swamps where a man could drown standing up. When the Japanese reached the ridges, expecting only small arms fire, they were instead met by a rain of high-explosive steel. The 25-pounder was not just a gun, it was a curse. At the Ower's Corner and later at the Yora Creek, the Australian gunners placed their pieces on high ground, overlooking the very trails the Japanese were forced to use. The first rounds didn't just cause casualties, they shattered the Japanese psychological advantage. For the first time in the campaign, the IJA found themselves pinned down in a terrain where they thought they were the hunters. The ghosts of the jungle suddenly found themselves exposed, staring up at the ridges as the Australian 25-pounders began to methodically dismantle their formations. This was the birth of a dark hatred, a deep, visceral resentment toward a weapon that turned the invincible Japanese spirit into nothing more than targets in a calculated kill zone. The Japanese hatred for the QF 25-pounder was not born solely from its presence on the battlefield, but from its terrifying versatility. Most artillery pieces of the era were specialized. A gun was designed for long-range, flat-trajectory firing, while a howitzer was meant for high-angle, rainbow shots to hit targets behind cover. The 25-pounder, however, was a mechanical chimera. It was a hybrid that could perform both roles with lethal efficiency. In the jagged, unpredictable terrain of the Pacific Islands, this meant the Australians could fire directly into a Japanese bunker at point-blank range, or launch shells high over mountain peaks to crash down into hidden valleys. But the true technical nightmare for the Imperial Japanese Army was the gun's rate of fire. A standard crew could comfortably fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute, but a well-trained, hot Australian crew could push that to a staggering 10 or 12 rounds in a fire mission. To the Japanese soldiers hunkered down in the brush, it didn't sound like a few guns. It sounded like a continuous, mechanized wall of explosions. The Australians utilized a unique, circular firing platform that allowed the gun to be rotated 360 degrees in seconds. This meant that even if the Japanese tried to outflank the position, the 25-pounders could pivot and re-engage almost instantly, leaving the attackers with no blind spots to exploit. The ammunition was the final ingredient in this recipe for despair. While standard high-explosive HE rounds were devastating enough, the Australians frequently employed air-burst shells. These shells were fitted with time-delay fuses designed to detonate several meters above the ground. For the Japanese infantry, this was a terrifying evolution in lethality. In the traditional logic of war, a foxhole or a trench was a sanctuary from artillery, but with airburst, the ground offered no protection. The explosion occurred overhead, raining a lethal cone of white-hot, jagged steel fragments vertically downward. Japanese soldiers found themselves in a horrific predicament. Staying in their trenches meant being shredded from above. while jumping out meant being mowed down by Australian small arms. This weapon system turned the natural protection of the jungle into a trap. The thick canopy, which the Japanese often used for concealment, would sometimes catch the shells and cause them to detonate prematurely, spraying shrapnel through the foliage. The 25-pounder was no longer just a piece of hardware. It was an all-encompassing system of destruction that made the Japanese feel as though the very sky was collapsing on them. It was a multi-role monster that ensured wherever a Japanese soldier hid, the 25-pounder could find him. The raw power of the 25-pounder was formidable, but its true lethality lay in the invisible web of intelligence that guided its steel. In the dense green labyrinth of the New Guinea rainforest, you could rarely see more than a few meters ahead. In such an environment, artillery should have been blind. However, the Australians developed a system of fire support so precise and responsive that it turned the chaotic jungle into a pre-programmed trap. This was the work of the forward observers, FOs, the unsung eyes of the artillery who operated in the shadows of the front lines. These forward observers were among the bravest men in the Australian Army. Often crawling on their bellies through mud and razor grass, they would infiltrate within earshot of Japanese encampments. Equipped with portable radios or dragging miles of telephone wire, they whispered coordinates back to the gun pits miles away. Because the Australian artillery units had pre-registered the terrain, carefully calculating the elevation and range for every major trail, junction, and clearing long before the enemy arrived, the response time was terrifyingly fast. When a Japanese officer gave the order to assemble, the Australians were already adjusting their sights. This created what military historians call a calculated kill zone. The Japanese would move along a forest path, believing they were hidden by the impenetrable canopy, only to have a salvo of shells land with surgical precision in the center of their formation. There was no need for ranging shots that might give the enemy time to scatter. The first round was often a direct hit. This level of coordination turned the jungle from a Japanese playground into a shooting gallery where the hunters were being tracked by an unseen, distant predator. The communication network was the backbone of this terror. The whinny radios and the dedicated lines between the infantry and the gunners meant that an Australian platoon commander could call for a curtain of fire almost instantly. If a Japanese unit attempted a flanking maneuver, the forward observer would simply transmit a coded string of numbers, and the 25-pounders would shift their fire in seconds. The Japanese infantry found this level of synchronization impossible to comprehend. They began to believe that the Australians possessed some form of supernatural forest sight, or that the trees themselves were reporting their positions. In reality, it was a masterpiece of organizational discipline and technical skill. By the time a Japanese soldier heard the distant thump of the gun, the shell was already descending upon his exact coordinate, leaving no room for error and no hope for escape. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the Banzai charge was more than a tactical maneuver. It was the spiritual essence of their military identity. Rooted in the ancient code of Bushido, it was based on the belief that a bayonet charge fueled by absolute spiritual resolve could shatter any Western army reliant on mere machines. However, on the battlefields of New Guinea and the Pacific, this fanatical spirit collided with the cold, mechanical reality of the Australian 25-pounder. The result was not a glorious struggle, but a systematic slaughter that crushed the very soul of the Japanese infantry. The nightmare usually followed a predictable, horrific pattern. Japanese commanders, believing that a massed high-speed assault would overrun the Australian lines before their artillery could react, would assemble hundreds of men for a decisive strike. They would scream Banzai and surge forward, a sea of steel and shouting men. But as we have seen, the Australian calculated kill zones were already waiting. The 25-pounder crews, informed by their forward observers, would unleash a wall of fire that caught the Japanese in the open. Unlike small arms fire, which a soldier might hope to dodge or survive through sheer luck, the 25-pounder shells created a perimeter of total destruction. The high explosive rounds would tear apart the jungle floor, while the airburst shells disintegrated the air above the charging men. The Banzai spirit evaporated the moment the first salvo landed. Instead of a heroic clash of bayonets, the Japanese found themselves trapped in a whirlwind of hot iron and flying timber. Formations were obliterated in seconds. Officers were killed before they could even draw their swords. and the momentum of the charge was replaced by a paralyzed state of shock. This led to a profound psychological collapse. The Japanese soldiers began to realize that their bravery was irrelevant against a weapon that could kill them from miles away with such terrifying accuracy. The Banzai charge, once a symbol of invincible willpower, became a source of dread. They watched as their comrades were shredded by a weapon that seemed to possess a demonic intelligence. Survivors spoke of the Australian thunder that followed them everywhere, a sound that signaled the end of hope. The impact was transformative. The Japanese lost their faith in the grand decisive charge. They saw that the Australians were not fighting a war of spirit, but a war of systems, where the 25-pounder acted as the ultimate judge and executioner. This realization shattered the morale of the Nankai Shitai and other elite units. The Banzai spirit didn't just die on the battlefield. It was buried under the weight of thousands of 25-pound shells, leaving the Japanese infantry hollowed out and terrified of the unseen guns that had turned their warrior code into a death sentence. By late 1942, the terrifying efficiency of the Australian 25-pounder had forced a radical and desperate shift in Japanese military thinking. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had begun the campaign as an aggressive, high-momentum force, found itself psychologically and tactically neutered. The realization was stark. To gather in large numbers was to invite immediate annihilation. The 25-pounder had successfully deplatformed the traditional Japanese style of warfare, forcing them to abandon the grand maneuvers they had mastered and retreat into a fragmented defensive nightmare. The most significant change was the absolute abandonment of the mass daylight attack. Japanese commanders realized that any concentration of troops larger than a squad was a magnet for Australian forward observers. Consequently, the Japanese were forced to adopt a policy of extreme dispersal. They broke their battalions into tiny isolated groups, hiding in the deepest recesses of the jungle, and only moving under the cover of torrential rain or the dead of night. This was a move made in desperation. It shattered their internal communication and made coordinated movement impossible. But it was the only way to avoid the calculated kill zones of the Australian gunners. Furthermore, the Japanese were forced to become burrowing animals. Since the 25-pounder's airburst shells made standard trenches death traps, the Japanese began digging increasingly complex and deep bunker systems. They tunneled into the reverse slopes of mountains and carved out L-shaped fortifications deep beneath the roots of giant rainforest trees, hoping that several meters of earth and timber would shield them from the vertical rain of shrapnel. However, this defensive posture stripped them of their greatest asset, the initiative. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, trapped in dark, damp holes, waiting in terror for the sound of the next barrage. Night raids became the only viable offensive option, but even these were fraught with danger. The Australians countered by using their 25-pounders to fire illumination shells, turning night into day and exposing Japanese infiltrators to deadly machine gun fire. The Japanese began to view the 25-pounder as an omnipresent entity, a god of war that dictated when they could move, where they could sleep, and how they could fight. This shift in tactics was a tacit admission of defeat. By forcing the Japanese to abandon large-scale operations, the 25-pounder had effectively won the war of attrition before the main infantry battle had even concluded. The Japanese were no longer fighting to win territory. They were fighting to survive a weapon they could neither see nor strike back against. The dominance of the 25-pounder had turned the once proud Imperial Army into a shattered force of shadow dwellers, marking the beginning of the end for the Japanese dream of conquering the Pacific. The overwhelming success of the 25-pounder on the front lines was not a product of luck. It was the result of a massive industrial and educational effort back in Australia. While the Japanese were fighting at the end of a collapsing supply line, the Australian diggers were supported by a domestic war machine that had transformed the country into the arsenal of the South Pacific. This logistical superiority, combined with a rigorous culture of training, turned the 25-pounder from a mere weapon into a flawlessly maintained engine of war. One of the most critical factors was the localized production of ammunition. Unlike the Japanese, who often faced chronic shortages of shells and were forced to ration their fire, the Australians had a steady stream of high-explosive and airburst rounds flowing directly from factories in Melbourne and Adelaide. In the humid, corrosive environment of the New Guinea jungle, ammunition could easily spoil or misfire, but the Australian supply chain was remarkably resilient. This abundance allowed Australian gunners to maintain a generous rate of fire, ensuring that when a target was identified, it was not just suppressed, but completely obliterated. Beyond the hardware, the human element was the true secret to the gun's lethality. The Royal Australian Artillery, ERA, emphasized a level of teamwork that bordered on the telepathic. A standard six-man crew lived, breathed, and worked in a tight, synchronized loop. Each man, from the layer who aimed the piece to the loader who slammed the shells home, was a specialist. Through thousands of hours of drills in the Australian outback before deployment, they had shaved seconds off every part of the firing process. This precision meant that the first ranging shot was often unnecessary. The crew could trust their calculations and their equipment to hit the mark on the first attempt. This culture of excellence extended to the integration between the infantry and the artillery. In the Australian system, the artillery was not a distant, separate entity, but an intimately connected partner. The forward observers lived in the mud with the infantry, sharing their rations and their risks. This created a bond of total trust. When an infantryman called for fire, he knew the shells would fall exactly where they were needed, often dangerously close to his own position, without the fear of friendly fire. The Australian soldiers developed a deep emotional affection for the weapon, famously calling it the gun that never let us down. While the Japanese soldiers viewed the 25-pounder with a dark, visceral hatred, the Australians saw it as their guardian. It was a symbol of their nation's ingenuity and their kinsmen's skill. This combination of domestic industrial strength and world-class crew discipline ensured that the 25-pounder remained the undisputed master of the Pacific battlefield, providing a lethal shield for the Australian infantry and a constant, thundering reminder to the enemy that the tide of war had irrevocably turned. The terror inspired by the 25-pounder in the jungles of New Guinea was not an isolated phenomenon. While the Japanese in the Pacific were learning to loathe the Australian thunder, the weapon was simultaneously carving out a legendary reputation across every major theater of World War II. From the blistering sands of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy and the jagged peaks of the Italian mainland, the QF 25-pounder proved itself to be perhaps the most successful and beloved field gun of the mid-20th century. It was the backbone of the British Commonwealth's fire support, a reliable hammer that shattered the ambitions of the Axis powers wherever they stood. In the Western Desert Campaign, the 25-pounder was instrumental during the pivotal battles of El Alamein. Here, the Australian 9th Division utilized the gun's unique circular firing platform to fend off German panzer divisions. Unlike other artillery that could be easily outflanked, the 25-pounders at Tobruk and El Alamein could pivot 360 degrees to engage Rommel's tanks with armor-piercing rounds at point-blank range, acting as both field artillery and formidable anti-tank guns. Even the elite Africa Corps grew to respect the rapid, accurate stonks, concentrated barrages, that the Australian and British gunners could summon in an instant. As the war progressed into the mountains of Italy and later the plains of Burma, the 25-pounder continued to adapt. In Burma, much like in New Guinea, its ability to be disassembled and transported via pack mules or light aircraft made it the only source of heavy fire support in terrain where modern tanks and heavy bombers were useless. The Japanese forces in the China-Burma-India theater faced the same calculated kill zones that had decimated their comrades in the Pacific, further solidifying the weapon's status as the ultimate jungle buster. Even after the surrender of Japan and Germany, the 25-pounder refused to fade into obscurity. It saw extensive service during the Korean War, where Australian gunners once again used it to hold back massive human wave assaults during the Battle of Kapyong. In the freezing ridges of Korea, the gun's reliability in extreme temperatures and its devastating airburst capability proved as effective against the Chinese Volunteer Army as it had against the Imperial Japanese Army a decade earlier. The global impact of the 25-pounder lies in its longevity and the tactical shifts it necessitated. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of Commonwealth military synergy. It proved that a medium-caliber gun, when designed with enough versatility and manned by highly disciplined crews, could outperform much heavier and more complex systems. Today, the 25-pounder is remembered not just as a piece of museum steel, but as the weapon that defined the Australian artilleryman's identity, a legacy of precision, reliability, and an unwavering commitment to the soldiers on the front line. It remains a testament to a time when a well-placed shell could turn the tide of a global conflict. The story of the QF 25-pounder in the Pacific is more than a chronicle of ballistic superiority. It is the story of a fundamental shift in the nature of modern warfare. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the war was supposed to be a clash of wills, a spiritual crusade where the purity of the warrior's soul and the Banzai spirit would inevitably overcome the material wealth of the West. But on the bloody ridges of New Guinea and the muddy tracks of the Solomon Islands, that mystical belief was ground into the dirt by the cold, calculated logic of Australian fire support. The 25-pounder did not just kill soldiers, it executed an entire military philosophy. The dark reason the Japanese hated this gun so intensely was that it rendered their primary virtue, absolute suicidal bravery, completely irrelevant. In the face of a calculated kill zone and the vertical rain of airburst shrapnel, a soldier's willingness to die for the emperor did not bring him closer to victory. It only made his demise more certain and less productive. The 25-pounder proved that a well-organized system of track thesis, observation, communication, and industrial logistics was more powerful than any amount of individual fanaticism. It was the triumph of the system over the swordsman. To the Australian diggers, the 25-pounder remains an immortal icon. It was the guardian of the jungle, the thunderous voice that spoke when the infantry was pinned down and the odds seemed insurmountable. It was a weapon born of necessity and perfected through the ingenuity of a nation that refused to be intimidated by the scale of the Japanese threat. The men who hauled these steel monsters through the New Guinea mud were not just artillerymen, they were architects of a new kind of special operations warfare, proving that heavy fire could be made mobile, adaptable, and surgically precise in the most extreme environments on Earth. Ultimately, the legacy of the 25-pounder is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and institutional discipline. It taught the world that a small, highly trained group of professionals, backed by a resilient domestic industry, could neutralize an enemy that possessed far greater numbers. The Japanese Banzai charge died at the mouth of the 25-pounder, replaced by a modern era of combat where intelligence and coordination reigned supreme. As we look back on the history of the Pacific War, the QF 25-pounder stands as a silent sentinel of the Allied victory. It was the weapon that broke the spirit of the invincible Imperial Army, turning the tide of the war one precise shell at a time. It remains in the hearts of veterans and historians alike, the gun that never let us down, a masterwork of steel and spirit that ensured the darkness of fanaticism would eventually be shattered by the light of precision and the thunder of Australian resolve.